Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are here to talk through our webinar on Back to Basics, Understanding and Implementing the McKinney-Vento Act. So we are so appreciative of you taking your time and your energy to be with us today for this really important topic. Just a couple of notes as we jump in, and then we will introduce ourselves as a team and get ourselves started here today. Our webinar is going to last about an hour. It's listed as 75 minutes, so we'll have some time at the end for questions, but our content will be about an hour. If you have questions as we go, we anticipate there will be many. Please type those into the Q&A box, and we will do our best to answer them. If we are not able to answer them, we will definitely follow up and provide more information and try to answer as many as we can after our time together as well. So send us your questions. We are happy to take a look at those. We are recording this session today, and so once our session is done, you will have access to the recording as well as the slides, and you will receive a certificate of your attendance today during our webinar. So that will all be sent to you after our session today. And then also want to just say as we're getting started, if you are not connected to our community on Slack, this is a great place to continue our conversation. So if you're new or you're just here for a refresher, we want to just encourage you to sign up for our Slack community to connect with others who are on this call today and other liaisons and state coordinators across the country. So definitely do that if you have not had an opportunity yet to do so. And if you are not familiar with us at Schoolhouse Connection, we are a national nonprofit advocacy organization, and our mission is to overcome homelessness through education from prenatal to post-secondary. And so we do this through strategic advocacy and practical assistance. And so we've got a great webinar for you today with some expertise on our team. And if you have not connected with us already, I do want to say we have so many resources available to you on our website from everywhere from prenatal to post-secondary and everything in between, as well as state and federal policy advocacy and information on our scholarship program. So please visit our website, check us out online. And another great way to stay connected is to join our newsletter listserv. So you'll get newsletters with updates and resources from us, and that's a great way to stay connected to all of us. If I have not had the opportunity to meet you, my name is Karen Rice. I am the Senior Program Manager of Education Initiatives here at Schoolhouse Connection. And I want to just take a second to pause and let my colleagues introduce themselves as well.
Hi, everyone. Barbara Duffield, the Executive Director of Schoolhouse Connection. Thanks for being with us today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Anna Sophia Treyes, K-12 Senior Program Manager on our Schoolhouse team.
And I'm Erin Patterson, Director of Education Initiatives.
Excellent. Thank you so much, team. All right, and so as we get started, I want to just talk through our learning objectives for our time together today. So these are our 4 objectives. This is where we're headed with our time, and it is our hope that at the end of this time together that you all will be able to describe the relationship between homelessness and education in a way that really helps to advocate and make the case for the McKinney-Vento Act. We hope that you'll be able to describe living situations that are covered under the McKinney-Vento Act, as well as strategies to identify students. We hope that you'll become familiar with basic McKinney-Vento policies, as well as how to implement them, and then also learn about different funding opportunities to support students experiencing homelessness, including Title I Part A funds. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about funding sources today and really how to use our funds to implement and to carry out the responsibilities that we have under McKinney-Vento. So as we're getting started, I want to ask my colleagues if they'll launch our quick poll for us here today. So we are going to spend just a second here filling out a poll. Hopefully you all can see this. So if you can take a second to answer this, we would love to have your input. I actually cannot see the poll, so if you can't see it, please let us know.
Karen, sorry to interrupt. I don't have the launch poll feature on my end, so if you have it and can launch it, that's great. If not, we can ask folks to share their level of knowledge in the chat with us today.
I do not have a button for that. So, all right. We will improvise. Instead of answering our poll question, if you wouldn't mind answering in the chat, we would love for you to rate your knowledge of McKinney-Vento. So maybe you're a brand new liaison, maybe you've been a liaison for a few years, maybe you've been a liaison or a state coordinator for many years, maybe you're new to your role as a state coordinator. Wherever you're at in your learning and your knowledge of McKinney-Vento, we would love for you to drop that in the chat. So if you could just give us a little bit of an introduction to who we've got in the room, that would be great. And that's super helpful for us to know where everyone is coming in. So as you continue to do that, and as you drop that into the chat, I am going to turn it over to Barbara to get us started.
Great. Well, again, good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. As Karen mentioned, we're really excited to see so many of you back for this Refresher Back to Basics webinar, particularly right now with so many changes that are happening in our education and our economic landscape. It's really important to stay grounded in the law, which has not changed and remains in place to protect educational access and success for students experiencing homelessness. Also, I just want to highlight, as Karen mentioned, we are offering this session to you today as a tool and as a resource that you can adapt to your own communities, your own trainings. So this PowerPoint is available to you, not just, we'll send it out afterwards, of course, but also as an editable resource on our website. So as we're going through it today, think about how you might tailor this for your own uses. Now, of course, the law that we're going to go over today makes sense in the context of the problem that it was meant to address, which is the educational barriers that are caused by homelessness. So with this slide, we're showing you the trends over the past few years based on the most recent national data. We always caution that these numbers only reflect children and youth who are identified as homeless, but even so, nationally and in most states, what we're seeing is that identified numbers are at or above pre-pandemic levels. And we also want to call out that other research shows that the prevalence of homelessness for youth is equal in rural, suburban, and urban areas. It's just much less visible. On the next slide, we'll get a glimpse of where students were staying when they were first identified as homeless by public schools. So this is a visualization that can be helpful to show the hiddenness of homelessness and particularly the lack of shelter in almost every community, because you see that the majority of students are staying temporarily with other people. They're not in shelter because there isn't shelter or there are barriers to shelter. The other piece that we like to point out and can be helpful as you're doing trainings as well is that these aren't static categories. They're fluid. And so we know that children move between each of these living situations over the course of the year. And in a few slides later, not yet, we'll show you where you can get this zone data if you don't already have it for your own community. So you can explain, again, the most common living situations for children and youth who are homeless in your community. On the next slide, we wanted to share a longer term look at trends to really help us set the stage for the role of schools in addressing homelessness. So this also can be very helpful for when you do get questions about the education definition or the HUD definition and the numbers and the different stories that they tell. So from this slide, you can see that the school numbers reflect broader events, broader dynamics in our nation. So for example, the numbers go up during natural disasters, they go up during economic downturns, and in the pandemic, they went down because, of course, the eyes and the ears of the school system were not on children and youth. Over time, generally, there's an upward trend, but we have those fluctuations due to the external world. Whereas when we look at HUD numbers, which is just shelters and street, you see it's relatively flat because we're essentially just looking at shelter capacity. It's really just the last 2 years that we see the upward trends. So again, sharing with you as part of the context when we were explaining McKinney-Vento, it's helpful to see these two pieces next to each other. On the next slide, though, this really is our theory of change. This is our why. This is our entire rationale behind our work to implement the McKinney-Vento Act, laid out in this diagram. So you see the many barriers that are caused by homeless to school access, the moving around, the trauma, the invisibility, enrollment barriers, health barriers, having other responsibilities like caring for siblings or parents. And you see how that directly translates into educational outcomes, whether it's declining enrollment, chronic absence, mental health challenges, high school graduation, and lower post-secondary enrollment. So we underline this because we know that education is essential to break the cycle of homelessness. It's the single greatest risk factor associated with being homeless as a young adult. So this really makes education and our training today a critical intervention in academic success, but also in preventing future homelessness. And just to spell that out a little bit more clearly, on the next slide, we present to you the most recent national chronic absence rates for the 22-23 school year. It's probably not surprising to anybody that the chronic absence rate of students who are homeless is 20 percentage points higher than other students. But we should take note, and this will probably look the same in your own communities, of the difference between students who are homeless and other low-income students. So in this case, we're looking at Title I. The difference between homeless students in Title I in terms of chronic absence, actually a 12 percentage point difference. So again, here we see that homelessness has an impact on attendance that's over and above poverty, and creates unique barriers. On the next slide, we see the same pattern for high school graduation. And again, this may look similar in your own communities, but we see a 13 percentage point difference between students who are homeless and other low-income students, again, Title I students. So the point to make here is that nothing about these statistics is inevitable. We do see school districts making progress. We know there are some school districts that are closing these gaps. And most of all, we know that our students have tremendous potential, and it's really up to all of us to remove those barriers to their success. On the next slide, we just want to make sure everybody is aware of our recently launched resource that allows you to explore homelessness education data at the state, county, and school district levels. So this is if you don't already have access to your own data in your own communities, this is a great resource. So you can make your own slides, for example, and localize the impact of homelessness on education, where they're staying, et cetera. We know that some districts may have more recent data, but again, just wanted to share this with you as a resource so you can think about how you might create this training in your own communities. Without further ado, want to turn to our main topic today, which is the McKinney-Vento Act. Again, this is a law that was signed in 1987 by then President Ronald Reagan, so it's been around for 38 years. And over time, it has gotten stronger as the need for it grew, but also as we learned what worked best to ensure that homelessness doesn't deprive students of the education that they need to survive and thrive. Just want to make sure everyone understands that the law applies to all local educational agencies, all public charter schools. It remains and it is our blueprint. And there's nothing about executive orders or executive actions that supersede or change this law. It's still in place. And we also just want to, before I turn it back over to Karen, to just say that you will notice that on each of the next slides that talk about a piece of the law, we include the legal citation, the actual US code, for when you may need to cite chapter and verse and just really show our grounding in the law. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Karen to get into the rest of the presentation.
So when we talk about the McKinney-Vento Act and we're talking about the law, the first piece of this that's really important to know is that the law requires that every LEA designate a homeless liaison, a McKinney-Vento liaison, to carry out these duties that are required of us in the law. So there are 10 duties that are required of the liaison, or the liaison is required to ensure these things happen. So we know that at LEAs across the country, the way that the liaison role occurs in LEAs looks really different. So in some school district communities, it may be that the liaison is a full-time position working with students experiencing homelessness. And other LEAs, it may be that it is a part of a position, or there may be a team of people, or there may be contacts at schools. And so however this position looks in your school community, it's really important that we remember that the liaison is required to ensure that these duties are taking place. So we don't have time, unfortunately, to dig into every single one of these duties today, but I want to just put in a plug here that if you have not had an opportunity to check out our new liaison resource page, this is a hub that is full of information for new liaisons if you're learning about all of these different responsibilities, or if you're a seasoned liaison and you just need a quick place to have all of this in one location, this resource hub really covers all of these different points. It offers strategies and tools and resources. So as we don't have time to dig into all of them, please check that out. And I also want to say that if you have not had an opportunity to look at our liaison self-assessment tool, this is another really great resource for you to really think about with the capacity and what that looks like within your LEA community. So I want to just plug those two resources, and as we go forward, to really think about how this looks in your LEA and in your school community, and how these responsibilities are taking place. So as we start to talk about McKinney-Vento and we start to talk about the role of the liaison, I think it's really important that we pause to ground ourselves in what is McKinney-Vento? How does McKinney-Vento define homelessness? So under the McKinney-Vento Act, we are looking at the definition of homeless is a child or youth who lacks fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. And so every situation that we encounter as a liaison, this is our filter that we always run all of those situations through. This is kind of our North Star and our guiding principle of, is this situation fixed, regular, and adequate? Does this child or youth meet that definition of having fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence, or do they lack fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence? So when we talk about this, we're looking at, can the student go to the same place every night and sleep in a safe and sufficient space? Again, these are our eligibility criteria. We're always looking at fixed, regular, and adequate for all of the situations of eligibility for our students as we think about identification. So when we talk about eligibility, we want to make sure, again, that we are looking at each of these situations that might be eligible for our students. So first and foremost, talking about who is eligible under McKinney-Vento. Excuse me. And that is students who may find themselves sharing the housing of others due to loss of housing, economic hardship, or similar reason. This is often referred to as doubled up. It might be families who are doubled up or tripled up or quadrupled up, but it is those shared housing situations due to loss of housing, economic hardship, or similar reason. We are also looking at students who are living in motels, hotels, trailer parks, or campgrounds due to a lack of alternative adequate accommodations. Students who are living in emergency or transitional shelters, and students who are living in cars, parks, oh, excuse me, I'm so sorry, abandoned buildings, substandard housing, buses or train stations, or similar settings. Now, when we talk about this category, I want to just draw your attention for 1 minute to our substandard definition here. Because often what I hear from liaisons is when we're having conversations about substandard housing, so sorry about that. When we're having conversations about substandard housing, it can feel a little bit like we're imposing our own judgment on what is substandard or what is not substandard. And so I want to just make sure to point out that we have guidance from the U.S. Department of Education that defines the substandard housing for us. We're looking at things like utilities, infestation, mold, or other dangers. And so it's not our own judgment of what is substandard or not substandard, but we're always going back to what this guidance from the Department of Education provides for us when we're looking at substandard housing. I want to also add that there may be housing codes in your state or in your community that also define substandard housing, so you can also take a look at that. But I think it's really important to just know that we can always go back to what the guidance tells us on substandard housing. And I want to pause for just a minute and talk about unaccompanied homeless youth. And so when we talk about our unaccompanied youth, we're really looking at a child or youth who lacks fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence and is not in the physical custody of a parent or legal guardian. And so we first look at that overarching, does that child lack fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence? And then we look at if that child or youth is staying with their parent or their legal guardian. So when we look at this, we know that an unaccompanied youth can be a student of any age. Typically, when we think of unaccompanied youth, we often think of our older students who may leave home for various reasons, may be kicked out for various reasons, but it's really important to remember that it can be a student of any age. I always share a story of when I was a liaison, I worked with a student in our 4K program who was identified as an unaccompanied youth. The parent had been unexpectedly incarcerated in another city, and the student had been sent to our community and was bouncing around between different relatives' homes. And so even as a 4-year-old student, we identified that kiddo as an unaccompanied youth. So it doesn't have to just be our older students. It can be a student of any age within our LEA. And when it comes to identifying our students as unaccompanied youth, the most important piece to this is building trust. Our relationships with students are so important because it can be really scary or really hard to talk about a situation that happened at home. We may not know the situation, and we may never know the situation that led that student to lack fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. But having those trusted relationships are really key to being able to identify that student and to learn more about their living situation. And one thing I do want to mention is a question that we get often at Schoolhouse Connection, And so I want to just say that homelessness in and of itself is not a reason to report our unaccompanied youth to Child Protective Services. So there's a lot of questions. We could spend a lot more time talking about this than we probably have time for today. But this is often a question of, when we identify a student as an unaccompanied youth, do we automatically report that student to Child Protective Services? And the answer is no. Homelessness in and of itself is not a reason to do that. We always want to follow our mandated reporting requirements. And so make sure that you're doing that. But again, really looking at, are we reporting because we have those concerns that we need to follow under our mandated reporting requirements? So when we think about determining eligibility, and again, going back to, does that child or youth lack fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence? These are some questions that can help guide our conversations. I often hear from liaisons that they're unsure about the idea of asking questions. Sometimes it feels like we're asking questions and we might not know how to ask those questions to gain the information that we need, or it might feel invasive and that we're not quite sure how to say what we need to say without it sounding like we're trying to be in the business of our families or the youth that we're working with. So I do want to say that it is okay to ask questions to help determine that eligibility. So you can ask questions in a way that is safe and supportive to that family or to that youth, to find out really what that living situation looks like and whether or not that child or youth lacks fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. So these are some questions that can help guide those conversations. But every single situation that we encounter, if we're asking these questions and we're looking at that eligibility, we want to make sure that we're looking at every situation individually. So we never want to make a blanket statement that everybody in this particular area of our community, for example, is eligible under McKinney-Vento, but we look at every situation on a case-by-case basis. And we sometimes use these questions too when we think about our families who come from other cultural backgrounds, that sometimes it may be a cultural value or a cultural norm that our students are in shared housing or multi-generational housing situations. And I want to say that these questions can help guide those conversations as well, because we may find that many of our families, and we often find that many of our families who come from different cultural backgrounds may be in those shared living situations because it is actually a homeless situation, and that child or youth may be eligible under McKinney-Vento. So again, going back to all of those situations on a case-by-case basis. So let's talk about strategies for a minute. So we know what definition we have of McKinney-Vento. We know what our eligible situations are. What are the strategies that we can use to help us identify students? So I want to share a couple with you. First and foremost, avoid using the word homeless. So we know that there are programs across the country where they talk about children in transition or students in transition or families in transition, or there's other ways to talk about our students who are eligible under McKinney-Vento that avoids the word homeless. And the reason for that is the word homeless can often carry with it a stigma, or families may not see themselves as homeless, particularly those who are in doubled up or shared housing situations. They may say, well, I have a roof over my head. That means I'm not homeless. And so we can avoid that stigma and we can avoid some of those identification challenges by really thinking about the language that we're using to talk about our students and our families. It's important to be aware of signs of homelessness and how to refer students to the liaison. We have a really great tool on our website that is something that you can use with your school staff, talking about the different things that we may see at school, different behaviors or different challenges that our students have, and how those could possibly be signs of a student experiencing homelessness. And so know what that process is. And if you're a liaison, make sure that you have a process so that as you're talking about McKinney-Vento and you're building awareness with your school staff and your school district personnel in general, that they all know how to send that information to you. I often say a Google form is a really great way to do that because it's a way to get information very quickly from one staff person to the liaison, to have that information to follow up with a student. But think about what might work best for you in your community. Thinking about asking questions or information about homelessness on school enrollment documents. We often talk about housing questionnaires and the importance of giving that opportunity for families to self-identify during that enrollment process. So if you don't already use a housing questionnaire, I would encourage you to consider how you can embed that information either into your enrollment in paper form or into your online enrollment process. And speaking of enrollment processes, we want to make sure that our online enrollment process does not create barriers for our students or families experiencing homelessness. So think about if a student or a youth doesn't have access to computers to complete that online enrollment, how can you create spaces and opportunities for them to still access those computers or that online enrollment process? Maybe that looks like offering space within your school buildings or within your district offices where families can come in or youth can come in and complete that. Maybe it's going out into the community and partnering with your public libraries or setting up office hours in shelters or in motels or different spaces where your families are and offering opportunities for that online enrollment process. It's also really important to think about how you're building awareness in your community. So posting flyers, using your website, using social media, and doing different social media campaigns to build awareness of what homelessness looks like in your community. This is a really important piece because your community organizations and service providers may find that they are interacting with students and families who are experiencing homelessness before you interact with them in your school district. And so having processes and building that awareness helps to get referrals from your community partners into your LEA as well. So that's an important piece of that process to identify. It's also a great idea and recommended to stay in touch with students and families on a regular basis. So this might include regular check-ins. It might include providing prepaid cell phones for your youth or your families who don't have access to those. We always want to think about asking about our younger siblings. So if you have a housing questionnaire that you use, for example, is there a space on there that asks about younger children in the home or asks about those non-school age siblings that might be wherever that student is staying or with that student or family? And then, of course, we want to make sure that we have partnerships with our community-based organizations who serve our students. So this might be organizations that serve our immigrant families, our Native families, our LGBTQ+ youth, our pregnant and parenting youth, our families and youth of color, whoever those partners are in your community. We want to make sure that we are connected with them so that they know how to contact us if they learn of a student who is experiencing homelessness. And then in turn, we can also be contacting them to help provide those resources and referrals for our students and families. All right. So we've identified our students, and that was a lot of information about identification. And so I want to talk about what comes next after that, and want to talk about the basic protections that our students have under McKinney-Vento once they are identified. So first and foremost, we're looking at school stability. So the law really is put in place so that students have the stability at school that they may not have at home or outside of school. And so each LEA, according to what's in the best interest of that child or youth, has to either keep that student enrolled in that school of origin or enroll that student in their school of residence or their local attendance school. So keeping that student in their school of origin for the remainder of that academic year, even if that student becomes permanently housed, or again, enrolling that student in their local area school. The law presumes that keeping a student in their school of origin is in the student's best interest, unless the parent or the unaccompanied youth has a different request and has a different wish for where to attend school. So we're going to dig into this and really what does that school stability look like? Because when we talk about school of origin, we always have questions around school of origin. And so I want to really take a minute to dig in and talk about our school of origin and what this looks like. So the school of origin is the school that the student attended when permanently housed, or the school in which the student was last enrolled in attending, including a preschool. So this is when we say that our students have the right to attend in the school of origin, and that is a basic protection that they have under McKinney-Vento. This is what we're looking at, the school that the student last attended when permanently housed, or the school the student was last enrolled in. So I want to pause for a second and talk about preschool because we typically have that as a follow-up question of, well, what is a preschool? And so a preschool is any publicly funded program for our children ages 0 to 5 that's LEA administered, whether that's a fiscal agent or whether it's an LEA program or a program that's accountable for providing early childhood education. So this definition comes right from our Department of Education guidance. And if you have more questions about school of origin and preschool, we will share this with you so that you've got this link and can dig in a little bit more to help to navigate those questions that you may have about whether or not your preschool programs in your community meet this definition. All right, so again, I mentioned a minute ago that the law presumes that keeping students in their school of origin is in the student's best interest. However, that is true unless it is contrary to the request of what that parent or guardian or youth wishes to do. So when we're thinking about best interest, we're thinking about really those student-centered factors. We're looking at if that student changes schools again, or if they've changed schools several times and now they've landed in a school where they're doing really well. Is moving schools going to affect their achievement? Is it going to affect their progress toward graduation? Is it going to affect their participation in extracurricular activities? And really looking at that whole student-centered factor on their achievement, their education, their health, and their safety. And again, thinking about what is in the best interest of that student. For our youngest students, our preschool age children, we also want to think about attachment to teachers. We know that for our youngest learners, that is so important. And it's important to think about, are there other preschool programs available? What are the quality of those services? How long will a student have to drive or be driven to get to those programs? And so we really want to look at, again, what's in the best interest of those students. When we're thinking about best interest, we always give priority to the request of the parent or legal guardian. And with our unaccompanied youth, we give priority to the request of the unaccompanied youth. Now, I will say, I think it's really important that when we're talking with our unaccompanied youth in particular, that we're providing as much information as we can to help that unaccompanied youth to make the best decision possible. So that may include things like laying out graduation requirements in the school of origin and graduation requirements in the school of residence and comparing the student's progress toward graduation, and really helping to provide all of that information to help the student to make the best decision and what's in their best interest. And when we talk about school of origin, of course, we have to talk about transportation. And so we know that this is a very hot topic. This is a very big challenge. We call it the big T transportation word. But schools and LEAs are required to provide transportation to and from the school of origin, including preschool programs, until the end of the year or the remainder of that academic year, even if the student obtains permanent housing. And so this is at the request of the parent or the legal guardian or the unaccompanied youth, and the liaison can support that by making that request on behalf of the unaccompanied youth. So if that student is staying within their school of origin, of course, the school of origin provides an arranged transportation. If the student is staying in another community and crossing LEA lines to get to that school of origin, both LEAs need to work together to determine how to provide that transportation. So there may be some creative transportation arrangements that take place. Maybe one LEA provides transportation to school and the other LEA provides transportation home. Maybe the buses meet at those district boundary lines. Whatever that looks like, LEAs can work together to determine that or to share the cost equally. And I do want to just say, I think it's really important for liaisons to be contacting the liaison in the sharing school. When I was a state coordinator, I often heard from liaisons who said, I don't know, I just got a bill for the student. I didn't know we had a student that we were sharing. I didn't know that we were sharing transportation costs. The bill would just show up. And so I want to say that I think it's a really good best practice to be in communication with the liaison in the sharing school. There might be opportunities for other transportation options that are more cost effective or efficient for the student. And so having that communication can be a really important piece of setting up that transportation. One other note about our transportation requirements is LEAs must provide students in homeless situations with transportation services comparable to those provided to other students. So typically this question comes up when we talk about walk zones. And so our students experiencing homelessness who might live in a walk zone, they absolutely can be included in that walk zone with their housed peers. However, there may be times when we need to think about other transportation options, or there may be barriers that are preventing that student from attending school. And so there may be occasions when we need to also look at removing that barrier to transportation. And so we want to make sure that we're addressing whatever those barriers include and that we're thinking about transportation for our extracurricular activities. Now, I could spend a lot of time talking about transportation, but unfortunately, we don't have the time today. And so I will say that we do have a resource on our website that talks more about transportation and gives some different strategies for that. So if you have questions, I would encourage you to check out that resource as well. All right, that was a lot of information. So I'm going to pause quickly and ask our Schoolhouse Connection team if there are any questions that are coming up that we can take a pause to answer.
Thank you, Karen. We have been monitoring the chat and the Q&A box and appreciate the questions that are coming in. I don't think there are any we should pause to answer now. We'll throw a few resources in the chat that can cover some of the issues that are being addressed, like unaccompanied homeless youth, terminology, early childhood education, but otherwise want to be mindful of time and encourage folks to keep submitting your questions. We will get to them, but we're going to keep going through the slides.
Excellent. Thanks so much. All right, so let's talk about immediate enrollment. And this is another protection that our students experiencing homelessness have under the law. So immediate enrollment allows for our students to be enrolled immediately into the school without those documents that are typically required for enrollment. So maybe that's a proof of residency, maybe that's immunization record or other school records. When our students experiencing homelessness come in to enroll in our schools, if they don't have those documents, McKinney-Vento requires that we enroll them immediately anyway. And so our students need to be enrolled and attending and participating fully in class, even in, in school activities, even without those documents. So sometimes that means that we have students who come in to enroll without a parent or guardian. So with our unaccompanied youth, maybe that youth enrolls themselves. Maybe the liaison works with that youth to enroll themselves, but we cannot require that parent or guardian to enroll that youth. For our younger unaccompanied youth, we can look to a caregiver or someone whom that young child is staying with who may be able to help support that enrollment. Or again, the liaison can enroll that student as well. Once we have a student enrolled, the liaison must assist in obtaining immunizations or other health records or screenings. So we want our students to be in school as quickly as possible, and then we can really work with that child or that youth or that family to get those other documents and those other missing records that we don't have. We can support them in doing that. And then also thinking about how we obtain records from previous schools. So I do hear that sometimes this transferring of records between LEAs is sometimes a barrier to enrollment. And there are ways to help remove this barrier. So we are required to enroll without previous school records, but maybe the liaison can reach out to the liaison in the previous district or to a school counselor and to get information about those records before the formal transfer of records might happen. So again, we want to be removing those barriers and making sure that we are doing that and thinking maybe through some of those creative ways to make that happen. So when we talk about removing barriers, I want to just pause here to say that this is a really important piece to the work that we do as liaisons. SEAs and LEAs must develop, review, and revise policies that are removing barriers for our students experiencing homelessness, including barriers that exist in identification, enrollment, and retention. So that might be barriers that are caused by outstanding school fees or fines or absences. And I know that many of you who are liaisons may not be a part of that policy review or that policy revision. As a liaison, I was not part of that. And so I really want to encourage you to find out who those people are in your LEA and to connect with them and to talk about what policies exist and how you can review those policies to make sure that you're not creating barriers. We do have a resource that we have shared with you on this slide that is a policy checklist that walks through what McKinney-Vento requires, what the law says, and gives you an opportunity to really look at your policies through the lens of what the law requires. So again, if you're not the policy writer, that's okay. But connecting with that person and helping to break down some of those silos so that you can be a part of those conversations is really important. So a couple of strategies that I want to share with you on removing barriers to enrollment and retention. We know that there can be so many challenges for our students. So I think it's really important that we're checking in regularly with our students. Now, as the liaison, it might not be you that's checking in regularly with students. When I was a liaison, I was district-wide, and so I really relied on my partners within the schools, different school settings, social workers and counselors, and other staff members that had connections to students and could check in regularly. And then they could let me know if there were barriers or there were things that they needed. But they were able to meet with students in that kind of face-to-face time on a regular basis to talk about how things were going and what that student might need. Providing one-on-one academic support is a great strategy to removing barriers. We know that our students that are highly mobile and that are moving and changing schools may have gaps in their learning. And so making sure that they have that access to academic support so that they're caught up in their classes and they're looking at their progress toward graduation and they can see themselves on that path toward graduation, no matter what age they are. Thinking about how we're providing the actual devices for our students. So students who may need to do work at home, do they have access to Wi-Fi, or do they have access to the technology that they need to make sure that they're able to complete their work outside of school, or providing spaces within school to do that during the school day? And I think this one is particularly important because connecting our students with extracurricular activities is such a great way to help our students to stay engaged. I know when I was working in a high school, many of my students were coming to school because of their extracurricular activities, and those were the connections that they had. And so making sure that we're really helping our students to find different areas that they can connect with and engage with. And then helping to build those connections. So rather than say, oh, you need to connect with coach so-and-so or this person who's the advisor, maybe we work with our students to say, let me connect you to that person instead of leaving it in the responsibility of the student to do that. We can take responsibility as liaisons to help build those bridges and get our students connected to those activities. So what happens if there's a disagreement? If there's a dispute that happens over eligibility, over school selection or enrollment, including that full participation, or what happens if the LEA determines that it's not in the student's best interest to remain in their school of origin, or whatever that school that's requested by the parent, guardian, or the youth? So if that happens, I want to put in a plug to say, make sure that you've got documentation of this because you will need all of that as you're providing that written explanation of that decision that's made. So having information on maybe why you've made that decision or what interventions you've tried that have led to a decision. Having documentation is a really important piece of this. And then providing that parent or youth with a written explanation of what that decision is, including the way to appeal that decision. And what's really important about this piece is making sure that we're doing this in a way that's really understandable and accessible to the parent, guardian, or the youth. So if we need to make sure that materials are translated, or we need to provide them in a different way, or verbally, or whatever that needs to happen to make that understandable and accessible to the parent or guardian or the unaccompanied youth is really important. And then that parent or guardian or unaccompanied youth needs to be referred to the liaison to carry out that dispute process as quickly as possible. So we don't want to have students in limbo. We don't want them to be wondering if they'll be able to remain in their school of origin or if they'll go to their school of residence. We want to carry that process out as quickly as we can to make that decision. And while that process is happening, it's really important that that student is enrolled in the school in which enrollment is sought through the entire dispute process. The law requires us to make sure that that student has access to full participation during that dispute process, including any appeals. So if the family or the youth appeals a decision, the student needs to remain in that school where enrollment is sought through that entire process. And then the same with our unaccompanied youth, that they have access to that school through the entirety of the dispute resolution process. So we could spend a lot more time talking about our dispute resolution process. But one thing I do want to say before I continue to the next slide is if you don't have a process in place already, or you're not sure what your process is, I really want to encourage you to go to whoever it is that created it, or maybe you need to create one. And to have that in place, we have to have a dispute process in place, and we need to have it in place before that dispute happens. It is imperative that our LEAs are following their dispute resolution process during a dispute, because there may be times when if the dispute process is not followed, it has to start over, or we end up finding ourselves unable to resolve the dispute expeditiously because that process was not followed. So if you don't know what the process is or you don't have one, I would say this is a really important area to start with when you're thinking about reviewing and revising your policies. All right, let's take a minute to talk about our high school graduation and college readiness. So LEAs, as part of our work and our protections for our students, are required to award partial credit for work that is completed. And so again, this comes directly from the law and from the Department of Education guidance. So one strategy to help support our students is to think about how to do a transcript audit to identify partial credits that may have been earned that aren't on the transcript, to look at what those credit recovery options are, to look at transcripts from previous schools and how those credits might fit together with your own credit requirements. Liaisons are also required to ensure that unaccompanied youth are informed and receive verification of their status as an independent student for financial aid. So for completing the FAFSA, or the free application for federal student aid. And so we have on this page a link to that verification letter that as a liaison you can complete to provide that to unaccompanied youth. And then finally, counselors are required to provide assistance to our unaccompanied youth and to our students experiencing homelessness to help prepare them for college. So if you're not already connected with school counselors in your LEA, this is a great place to start and to talk through these requirements and to look for ways to partner together and really how to make sure that you're meeting these requirements under the law. And I also want to take a minute to talk about preschool and again, our youngest learners. The law requires that liaisons ensure that our young children can access programs like Head Start, early intervention programs, and other preschool programs that our LEA administered. Many of these programs use the same definition of homeless as the McKinney-Vento Act, and they may have requirements for prioritizing children who are experiencing homelessness in their enrollment process. So connecting with your partners, your early childhood partners within your LEA and within your community is a really important piece to make sure that our preschool students have access to these programs. And again, we've got a great resource on this slide for you that is a checklist to work with that referral process for those early childhood programs. All right, that was a lot of information. I'm going to transition us to talk about funding sources, and then we'll pause again for questions. So when we think about all of these different pieces of McKinney-Vento, one of the questions that I hear a lot is, how do we fund this? How do we fund the different pieces? Where does the money come from for these programs? And so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that. So starting with Title I Part A, which is one of our greatest resources to support our McKinney-Vento programs. So under Title I Part A, McKinney-Vento students are automatically eligible for Title I Part A services, regardless of the school that they attend. So whether they attend a school that is a Title I supported school, whether they do or not, they are still eligible for Title I Part A services. And all LEAs that receive Title I Part A funds are required to set aside funds to provide services to students experiencing homelessness. So this is going to be a really important piece. We call them the set-aside funds, or the homeless set-aside funds. And using these funds is a great way to think about really the services that you're able to provide for your program. So when we think about the uses of our Title I Part A funds, it's generally governed by these two principles that are listed here in these first two bullet points. So Title I Part A funds can be used for services not ordinarily provided to other students, and those are governed by the principles of it has to be reasonable and necessary. So whatever we're spending our funds on has to be reasonable and necessary to enable our students experiencing homelessness to take advantage of educational opportunities. In addition, the funds have to be used as a last resort when there are not other funding sources to use or when we've exhausted other funding sources. So when we think about that, we need to think about what could we use our funds for? Maybe it's looking at helping support the cost of transportation to the school of origin. Maybe it's helping with the salary of the liaison and the person responsible for carrying out all of the responsibilities that we're talking about today. There are a lot of allowable uses under Title I Part A under our set-aside funds. And so, of course, we want to connect that back to the student's education, But that is so broad because there's so many different things that our students need that can help support their education. So I'm not going to read all of these to you. You will have access to these slides. This is directly copied and pasted from the Department of Education guidance, but all of these are different ways that we can use our Title I Part A set-aside funds to support our students experiencing homelessness. So when we think about how we calculate those funds, I think we can think about this in a number of different ways. And I do want to say that you may not know how this is calculated, or you may not know what your Title I set-aside funds look like in your LEA. And that's okay. This is an opportunity for you to start asking questions and for you to become a part of that process, to advocate for funds and to learn more about what's happening so that you can have a voice at the table when we're talking about funds and how many funds, what quantity of funds to set aside for our students. So maybe that set aside amount is determined based on a needs assessment, looking at trends of our data and our student identification over several years. Maybe there's a per pupil cost to that, and we're multiplying that by a per pupil cost, and the per pupil cost set by our Title I funds. We want to make sure that we're looking at the needs of our students multiple times during the year. So not just at that initial time of identification, or not just at that initial time during the year when we're talking about our Title I funds, but going back and relooking and what's coming up, what are we needing funds for, how are we supporting our students? And then the Department of Education guidance says we need to include an evaluation of the effectiveness of our past activities. So we want to be looking at, was this an effective use of our funds? Did it meet the needs of our students? What might we need to do differently? How did this affect our students and our programs? And really kind of taking some time to evaluate what that looks like. And I do want to say, if you have questions about Title I, bring those questions to our webinar. We have a webinar coming up on April 22nd where we're going to talk about making the most of these Title I Part A homeless set-aside funds. So if all of the things that I just said brought up a lot of questions for you and you were unsure and you want more information, please join us for this webinar, and we will be able to answer many of those questions during this time and give you some strategies as well to make sure that you are making the most of this as a funding source. And I want to take a minute to talk about other funding sources, because we have our Title I Part A set-aside funds, but we also have other funding sources that are available to us as LEAs and as liaisons. So I want to start by talking about McKinney-Vento Education for Homeless Children and Youth subgrants. Now, these are funds that come from the federal government to states, and states are required to competitively grant out at least 75% of these funds to LEAs. So it's a competitive process, but it looks a little different in every state. The timeline and the cycle of those grant funds is a little different in every state, and the process for that competitive grant is a little different in every state. So if you have questions, the best place to start is with your state coordinator. So this slide has a link to a directory of all of those state coordinators with their contact information, and I would encourage you to reach out to that person if you have not already. And I do want to say, with our subgrant funds, all of the activities that were allowable under the American Rescue Plan Homeless Children and Youth Funds are allowable with our McKinney-Vento EHCY subgrant funds, with the exception of hotels and motel stays. So if you were working on something and you had an initiative that you started with your American Rescue Plan Homeless Children and Youth Funds, you may be able to apply for subgrant funds to continue those activities. Again, check in with your state coordinator about that if you have questions. It's also a really great idea to connect with your federal programs director in your LEA. There are other federal programs like Title IV that supports student support and academic enrichment, Title III programs that support our English learners, Title I Part C programs that support migrant education, maybe Title II programs that support educator effectiveness and professional development. So connecting with your federal programs director might provide opportunities to really look at how you could braid and combine your funds together to best support your students experiencing homelessness. Because students experiencing homelessness might also be English learners, they might also be migrant students, they might also be able to access mental health supports under Title IV. And so there may be some creative ways to really navigate those funding sources and combining those. And the best place to start with that is with your federal programs director. There are also state and local funds that can be used from your LEA and your state to support your program. You can look at community schools, and really your community schools go through processes to apply for funds. And maybe you can include your students experiencing homelessness in those community school applications for those funding sources. I know there are several LEAs that have really strong McKinney-Vento programs because they have strong partnerships with their community schools foundations. So maybe look for opportunities to partner with your community schools folks as well. And then really accessing those community donations. That can be such an important piece of providing resources that funding sources can't provide within your LEA. So it may be an unrestricted funding source where you can have specific needs and you can go to your community partners who want to help and want to support your programs to say, hey, I need gym shoes for my students to participate in gym classes, or I need winter gear for our students to be able to enjoy their recess times during school. You know, we need boots and hats and coats. And so really leveraging those community partnerships and those community donations is a great way to meet some of those other needs as well. So I want to offer you a few strategies quickly about funding sources, and then we're going to pause for questions one more time. And then we'll continue on with our time together here. So a couple of strategies when it comes to funding sources. First and foremost, we talked a lot about Title I Part A as the set aside as a way to fund your program. But there may be state-specific set-aside requirements for either your Title I set-aside funds or other funding sources. So the best place to start if you have questions about that is to go to your state education agency or your state coordinator. So some states have different protocols for how a Title I Part A set-aside is determined. So make sure you know what those are and what those protocols are with your state-level partners. Using your data is a really important piece of this process. So earlier in our time together, you heard Barbara talk about all of the different data that we have available to us to really look at. And this data paints a picture of what the needs are and what the trends are in our LEA communities and in our school building communities. And so use this data and really look at the data specific to your LEA to advocate for funds. So again, looking at those trends and looking at what the needs are within your own LEA and within your community is a powerful tool to be able to say, this is what we need, this is what's happening right now, and here's how we can use the funds, and here's our plan to use the funds. Conducting a needs assessment, I mentioned this earlier. This is a really important way, again, to kind of look at trends over time, to look at what the needs of your students and your families and your unaccompanied youth are. And connecting with those federal programs offices and your business office partners. I want to say one of my best and favorite strategies to share is to learn to speak the language of your business office. So I often share a story of a liaison that I have worked with over the years who said that as a social worker, the first time she went to her business office, she had stories of her students and was sharing the stories in order to kind of garner an emotional response with her business office, thinking that that would help her to advocate for funds. And she said it didn't mean as much to them as it meant to her. And so the next time she went back to her business office, she went back with spreadsheets and charts and graphs and showed the data and showed the trends with her students. And that was really meaningful and significant to her business office. And they gave her the funds that she asked for because they could use that data to kind of see what it was she needed and to help understand why she was making the case for the amount of set aside funds that she was. And so learning to speak that language and learning to what will be meaningful and sharing this information with your business office partners is really important. This is an opportunity in general to break down those silos. So you are not alone in your work. You have teams of people, and we know that our students experiencing homelessness cross every program and could be any student at any time. And so it's a really important opportunity to break down those silos and to look for ways to partner with your business office, with your federal program directors, and to talk about how we are really using our funds to support our students. And I mentioned the evaluation of the effectiveness. Again, this language comes directly from the Department of Education guidance. So I would encourage you to take a look at that and to think about really how you are evaluating the effectiveness of the funding and how you're using that to meet student needs. All right, that was a lot of information. I am going to pause here again and ask my colleagues if there are any questions that are bubbling up that we should take a minute to answer. It sounds like there are a lot of them, so happy to jump in and start on those.
Karen, there are quite a few questions. I will try and organize them and maybe combine some as best as possible for you to start answering. We have a few questions on, I think, what would be considered the bucket of school of origin. One question, if the family has multiple students and becomes displaced, can parents elect to send one child to the district of origin and another child to the district of temporary residence?
They can. And I would say in that case, I would go back to having a conversation about best interest. And so sometimes those conversations of best interest happen really informally, like making sure that the family in that situation knows, okay, here are the school schedules, here's how that might affect, when one student is done with school or the different school breaks and things like that, making sure families have all of that information ahead of time. But yes, once the student is identified, they do have that right to attend. And sometimes it happens where students are split between school districts or LEAs.
And then another question says, I have students that live all throughout California who are counted for McKinney-Vento purposes through one county. Am I correct that that would be the county for me to ask for financial support for our students that have been identified as McKinney-Vento?
This is a great question. So I think the answer that I would give you is it depends. And so I would go back to, again, is that student in the school of origin? And then are they staying in another county so that you have that shared transportation cost? And then yes, that would be the person that you would go back to for that shared cost. And so I'm thinking that's maybe a transportation question. So it's for transportation in particular, the school of origin and the school district of residence are the ones who share that cost, or in some cases, counties.
Excellent, thank you. A couple questions have come in that I think are in the bucket of sort of communicating about McKinney-Vento to your administration within your LEA. So one asks, a new superintendent has come into the county and has started pushing back on the determinations that the liaison is making. How would you approach that from a liaison's perspective?
That's a great question. And that definitely happens. We have heard about that from other liaisons as well. I would first and foremost go back to the law. You have the law guiding you and directing you of who is experiencing homelessness and what that definition is of students experiencing homelessness. But more than that, I think I see that as an opportunity to educate that superintendent on McKinney-Vento. So while you have the law that's supporting the work that you do, it's a really important opportunity to say, this is what the law says, and here's what I do. Here are my practices, here are my procedures, and here's how I make that determination. I also think that it's really important that you keep case notes, on your students and on your identification. And so I will say, as a liaison, that was something that was really helpful to me. I could not remember every situation of every student that I interacted with and every family. So I had my own personal notes that I kept on students so that if somebody came back to me and said, hey, I have a question about this situation. Why is it that you identified this student? I had quick and ready access to that said, on this date, I talked with this student and this is what information I received, or this is how they addressed the questions that I had. Of course, we want to remember that student information is protected under FERPA, so we don't want to share student information if there's not an educational need to know. But those case notes were what really helped me to be able to go back and remember why I had made the decision that I made, and it was the way that I supported some of the decisions that I made. But you have the law on your side, and it's a really important opportunity to be talking and educating that superintendent on McKinney-Vento and what's required.
Thank you very much. We've gotten a few questions about walk zones. And so I'm wondering if you can add some information or clarify for students who have been identified as experiencing homelessness, who live within the walk zone. When is it okay to provide transportation? What has to be in place for other students? Any clarifications or additional information you can share on that piece?
This is a common question. I'm not surprised that this came up. So our students experiencing homelessness have access to transportation that's comparable to their housed peers. Excuse me, sorry about that. And so that does include walk zones. So if you have a student identified who is within that walk zone, that student definitely can walk to school and can have and access that same transportation, that same walk zone as their housed peers. Now, there may be times when that is a barrier that is affecting their enrollment and participation in school. And so there are different things that you can look at. Just because that student is within a walk zone, if there's a barrier, it doesn't mean you automatically need to provide transportation. In the case of a walk zone, what I might look at first as a liaison is there another student that I can connect this student or family to that comes from the same area, so the student isn't walking alone? Or is there another school staff member that could meet students? I know walking school buses have been a really important trend recently in transportation. So is there a school staff member that could meet students in a neighborhood in the walk zone, so that we have someone who is familiar with our school community, knows the families know, and they know they can trust and send their child with this person, and do kind of a walking school bus model to help with that walk zone. Sometimes with young children, there can be a fear of a parent to say, I don't want my young child to walk to school from this place that we're staying. We don't know this neighborhood, we're not connected. And so helping to build some of those connections and bridges can be really important. So finding other students or other families or a school staff member that can partner up. Sometimes there are times when it is a barrier, and the lack of transportation is a barrier even within that walk zone. Or there may be special circumstances that require transportation be provided. When I was a liaison, I worked with a student that was involved in a pretty significant domestic violence situation. And our local police department was involved. There were a lot of folks involved in that. And we had to provide transportation for that student from door to door because of the student's safety. And so we had our school bus driver picked that student up under the care of a grown-up and deposited that student with another grown-up at school. And we had to do that even though that student was in the walk zone because there were other safety concerns. So it's important to look at what those barriers are and then to think creatively and think outside the box of how to meet those and really how to remove those barriers. So it doesn't automatically mean that you have to set up a cab or set up a school bus, but there might be other ways to mitigate that barrier within the walk zone in particular. And I really, really love the idea of the walking school bus. So if you ever want to talk more about that, I would be happy to do that. We know in particular that one really accessible way for our families that come from other countries and other cultural backgrounds, that's been a great way to build some of those bridges and to have bilingual staff members go into those communities and do that walking school bus that really help build bridges between families with different cultural backgrounds and speakers of other languages. So I personally love the walking school bus idea and think that that is one way to help with that walk zone.
Okay, I know we're running short on time. There are two questions that I want to try and pose, and I will remind our participants that we will share these questions and answers out with you all. After the webinar, you will immediately receive a copy of the slides and the recording and a certificate for attendance today. So have no fear, we will follow up with resources, even if we didn't get to your questions today live. Two questions I will throw out at you, Karen, and then let you take it from there. The first one is we've had a few come up around doubled up. If you could talk a little bit about cultural considerations when reviewing doubled up situations, and then a question on when doubled up ends. When does doubled up become stable? So if you could address that piece. And then the second thing to address is a couple of questions have come in about determining eligibility for students returning in the fall who were identified the previous year and how you might handle that as a liaison.
Excellent. Well, let me start with that one because I think that's probably the most straightforward answer. One of the best ways to do that is to simply reach out to families who are identified the previous year. Whatever your student information system is, when I was a liaison, we did not roll over our students from one school year to the next, or roll over our McKinney-Vento identified students from one year to the next. We ended their McKinney-Vento eligibility at the end of the school year. Now, different school districts and different student information systems do this differently, so talk with your data people about this. But when I was a liaison, we ended that at the end of the school year. And then I had a report that I could pull and that our data folks could help me pull, that gave me the names of all of the students that had been identified in that year. And 2 weeks before school started, I reached out to every single one of those families or to our unaccompanied youth to ask about their living situation and say, I just want to check in. I want to find out where you're at. I want to talk about if you're still eligible. If you're not, let's help get you connected to other resources. And I reached out 2 weeks before school started so that on the first day of school, our students were ready to go. They all had their transportation set up and they were on the first day of school with their peers. And so doing that new identification at the start of every school year is an important piece of the process to make sure that you are following up with families who may have had their situation change over the summer. They may have become housed. Let me try to very quickly talk about the questions on Doubled Up. I could say a lot about these two different topics of Doubled Up, but I've got just a minute. So let me try to address these quickly, and then I'm happy to follow up more as well. When we think about our families who come from other cultural backgrounds, one of the things that we hear often is, it's a cultural value that they live together, or it's a cultural norm that they're in these shared housing situations. And so at Schoolhouse Connection, we use the phrase circumstance supported by cultural norms. So rather than simply saying it's a cultural norm or a cultural value that they're doing this, we want to look at, is it their circumstance that led them into this situation, into this shared housing situation? So things like generosity and family and hospitality are cultural values. Homelessness is not. And so it may be that the family had nowhere else to go and their extended family members said, come live with us till you figure it out. Maybe they got evicted, or maybe they don't know how to get an apartment, or they're newly arriving to the US and they don't know the system to do that. And they're being taken in by family or friends. It may be a cultural value that they have valued generosity and hospitality, but it's their circumstance of having nowhere else to go that brought them into that shared living situation. So we always want to look at the circumstance behind that. Where would they be if they weren't there? And so really looking at what led them to that shared housing situation. Where else could they go if they weren't staying in this situation? We can always go back to talking about asking those questions and doing that in a way that's safe and supportive, and partnering with our Title III or our ESL and bilingual staff members to help build some of those bridges, partnering with community organizations who serve and support families from different backgrounds to help have some of those conversations. So that was a very quick answer. And I think I missed the other one that you mentioned, Erin, the other Doubled Up question.
The other one was just around, when would you consider a doubled up situation to become stable? Is there an
yes, thank you. Yes, thank you. So I think, first of all, I want to say there's no time limit on homelessness. And we know that with the housing market as it is and the rental market as it is, that families are having a harder and harder time accessing and getting into stable housing. And so there's no time limit on the amount of years potentially that a student could be identified under McKinney-Vento. But again, I would say go back to those questions. And so if you ask a question like, where would you go if you weren't here? And the family says, well, I'm finally in a place where I could rent my own apartment, but this has really been working for us. They help with childcare, and I help with they help with childcare after school, and I help with childcare before school. And we've really got this shared partnership. And so really looking at what those other circumstances are and asking those questions. Again, it's okay to ask questions if it's for the purpose of determining that eligibility. And so thinking about where they would be if they weren't in that situation. So it becomes a mutually beneficial arrangement at the point where that family could be somewhere else. Where they say, I could rent an apartment, or I could get housing, but this has just become a circumstance that's really beneficial for all of us. And it's working for us to share these expenses and, to be in this arrangement. So there's no time limit on that. It may be years, it may be months. But again, asking those questions and really helping to understand that living situation is the best place to start. All right, I'm guessing there are many more questions, but I'm going to move us along because our time is very quickly coming to an end. Again, we will come back to your questions, so thank you for submitting those and sending those to us. We will answer as many of them as we can and get those answers out to you. But with all of the information and all of the things that we've talked about today, I want to just talk about a few next steps because I think that can be a really important piece of this. Someone mentioned in one of the questions about talking with a superintendent and how to have those conversations. I want to plug a new resource that we have. This is on creating kind of your elevator pitch around McKinney-Vento. If you're familiar with the idea of an elevator pitch, It is a quick way to talk about something in a way that's really succinct, so that you've got kind of a planned phrase or a planned paragraph when somebody asks about McKinney-Vento. This is a great way to go back and use your data to say, these are the trends. This is what McKinney-Vento is. This is our process to refer. And so really thinking through, what's your elevator pitch? When you talk about McKinney-Vento, what do you say? How do you bring all of this together and synthesize it in a really short and clear, concise way? So I'm excited to share this resource with you. This is a way to think about that and to really think about kind of the message that you're communicating in this elevator pitch. I also mentioned this earlier, but I want to plug our new Liaison Resource Hub. As someone who has worked with McKinney-Vento for quite a long time, I still use this webpage. It's full of great resources. And so this can be an important tool as well. If you're having conversations about McKinney-Vento and you're figuring out how to be a liaison and what that role includes, this is a great place to go for some easy resources and some best practices and things like that that are available to you. And then I want to just talk briefly about using this PowerPoint. So we are required to provide professional development to school personnel. And the best part is we've created this for you. So as you're thinking about providing that professional development on McKinney-Vento and on that referral process and how you're talking to folks in your LEA, you are welcome to use this PowerPoint to adapt it with your own state and local data, to include your own state procedures or your own local LEA procedures, to include your local resources, whatever is going to be most meaningful for you as you communicate about McKinney-Vento in your professional development that you provide. So please feel free to use this as a resource for you. And I want to talk very quickly, just a couple of additional resources to highlight. We have a couple of new resources that are available to you as well on talking about the federal protections of McKinney-Vento. Really looking at some of the different things that are happening in our country right now and how McKinney-Vento is affected and what all of that looks like. And so I want to encourage you to take a look at these resources and again, use these when you're talking about McKinney-Vento and when you're really looking at your program and what it is that you need to be communicating. We also have a webinar coming up on federal policy updates on March 26th. So if you have not signed up for this, this is new. It was just added. So would encourage you to sign up for this to hear from our federal policy team on those updates. And then, of course, we have some additional resources for you on some of the basics of McKinney-Vento, including identifying students, more on transportation, attendance, full participation, all of those topics that we talked about today. So again, you'll have access to these slides and to these links that will all be live when these go out to you after our time together. If you have more questions or you're not connected with us, please connect with us. We are on all social media. And again, our Slack community is an excellent way to connect not only with our team, but with liaisons from across the country to learn about practices and other things that are happening with LEAs and with liaisons around the country. Finally, I just want to mention our scholarship program. If you are not familiar with our scholarship program, it is a really unique and incredible scholarship opportunity for students. It is open to juniors, and so it is open right now. If you are working with students to think about their college or career opportunities and they're thinking about post-secondary options, please share this with students who are current juniors. So they have not only access to this financial scholarship, but also one-on-one support from our Schoolhouse Connection team and from their fellow scholars that are within this program. They have access to 3 all-expense-paid trips. It's a really amazing program. So again, share this with your juniors. The application is open until June. And more information, you can scan that QR code or visit our website for more information. We shared a lot with you today, so thank you so much for your time. We are so grateful for you joining us and taking time to learn about McKinney-Vento or to have that refresher on McKinney-Vento. Thank you for submitting your questions and for being engaged and participating in our time together. If you have specific questions or you need more information about something, please don't hesitate to reach out to our team. We are here for you and we want to support you in every way that we can. So this is our contact information for the 4 of us that were on this webinar with you today. And if we can't answer your question or we need to loop in our other teammates on other topics, including higher education, state and federal policy, we've got a lot of expertise on our team. So we're happy to help connect you with others on our team as well. Thank you again so much. We appreciate you joining us. Have a great rest of your day.